You have just arrived at Night's Night. Before we begin tonight's journey, find your comfortable position. Pull your blanket a little closer. Let your shoulders drop. And let your eyes grow heavy. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whether it is late evening or the quiet hours of the early morning, I am glad you are here. This channel exists for one reason: to give your mind somewhere beautiful to rest. Tonight we are traveling somewhere ancient, somewhere that most people have never heard told quite like this. And I think by the time this story finds its quietest place, you will already be drifting. Before we begin, if you have a moment, drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are listening from tonight. The time, the city, the country, whatever feels right. You would be surprised how many people around the world are doing exactly what you are doing right now. Lying in the dark, listening, resting. We are all here together. Now, set your screen aside. Get comfortable. Close your eyes if you would like. And let the story begin. This is the story of a world built slowly, stone by stone, year by patient year. It is the story of 16th century India, under a boy king who could not read but who listened better than anyone. An emperor named Akbar, who chose curiosity over conquest and built an empire not with force alone, but with something quieter. You will walk through the red sandstone courts of Agra and Fatehpur Sikri. You will smell the sandalwood smoke and the river clay of the Yamuna. You will meet farmers, weavers, merchants, painters, musicians and poets, ordinary people whose lives move to the rhythm of seasons and monsoons and the great unhurried flow of the river. This is history not as a list of dates, but as a place to rest, a slow drift into the warmth of a world long gone, carried forward by water and memory and the soft fall of night. The heat comes off the sandstone in slow waves, even now, long after the sun has dropped behind the flat line of the western plain. Your palm against the stone feels the day still trapped there, not burning, not urgent, just a deep and patient warmth that will take most of the night to fade. Somewhere above the rooftops, a voice drifts across the city. The mezzanines call rising and falling, each phrase lingering in the air like smoke before the darkness swallows it. Closer, much closer, water moves through a narrow stone channel, barely audible, a thin thread of sound that seems to have been running forever. The river clay along the banks gives off that particular smell. Cool, a little mineral, something ancient in it that you can't quite name, mixed into it, fainter now, sandalwood from someone's evening fire, and maybe the ghost of marigolds crushed hours ago under sandals and cartwheels. Agra settles into night the way it has always done, without hurry, without ceremony, just the slow release of light and heat and noise until only the river remains, moving through the darkness like it has nowhere to be and all night to get there. The Yamuna curves through the northern plains in a long, unhurried arc, its wide back catching the last of the sunset in shades of copper and dull gold. Along its banks, the grass grows tall enough to hide a grazing buffalo, and the ghats, stone steps worn smooth by centuries of bare feet, descend into water that stays cool even in the hottest months. That coolness comes from snow, from mountains so far north that the women filling their brass pots at dawn have never seen them, only heard the stories. White peaks that never melt, rivers born from ice, water that travels 1,000 miles to reach this flat land and still remembers the cold. At night, the river becomes a mirror, but not a perfect one. The stars break apart on its surface, reassemble, break again with each small ripple, so that what you see is not the sky, but the sky's memory, scattered and drifting. Agra grew up along this shore slowly at first. A few mud brick houses, a market, a fort, and then faster, as if the city had been waiting for permission to spread its walls across the floodplain. The sandstone they used came from nearby quarries, dragged by oxen in the dry season when the roads were hard. Red stone, but not one red. deep crimson where the sun hits it directly, softer rose in the shadows of the afternoon. And along the lower courses, where the river mist settles each morning, a darker shade, almost purple, like bruising on the flank of a sleeping animal. You can feel the history in those walls if you stand still long enough. Not as something dramatic, no ghosts, no whispers of forgotten kings, just a sense of weight, of years pressing down and being absorbed, turned into something solid. The masons who cut these blocks worked slowly, fitting each piece to its neighbour so precisely that a knife blade still cannot pass between them. They weren't building for a season or a decade. They were building for the kind of time that moves through empires the way water moves through stone, finding the cracks and wearing them smooth. From the top of the wall, if you listen past the dogs and the distant laughter of children still awake somewhere in the winding lanes, you can hear the city exhale. Stalls closing, brass lamps being lit in courtyard homes, a donkey braying once, then falling silent. The sound of water being poured from a copper vessel, someone's last washing before sleep. To the west, across the dry plains of Rajasthan, another city sits on a sandstone ridge, Fatehpur Sikri, built not for war but for wonder. The emperor who dreamed it wanted a place where poets and painters, musicians and holy men could gather under one sky, could argue and laugh and make things together without the weight of politics pressing down on every conversation. The streets there are wide and straight, lined with gardens where water runs through stone channels, and the air smells of jasmine and rosewater and the clean smoke from sandalwood fires. The great mosque rises at the city's heart, its white marble dome catching the first light of morning and holding it until the last moment of dusk, as if reluctant to let the day go. At the Buland Darwaza, the towering gateway that faces south, the emperor had words carved into the stone, a message in Persian welcoming all travellers, no matter their faith or their station, to enter and to rest. You might have walked through that gateway yourself, if you had been born 400 years earlier. Not as a noble perhaps or a courtier, but as someone simply passing through, a merchant from the coast with sacks of black pepper and cardamom. A weaver from Bengal carrying bales of muslin so fine that light passed through it like breath through gauze. A farmer from the Punjab leading a donkey loaded with wheat for the grain markets. The roads were safer then than they had been in living memory. Imperial horsemen patrolled the highways in quilted armour, curved swords hanging at their hips, and the old Grand Trunk Road, stretching from the mouth of the Ganges to the mountains of Afghanistan, had been widened and raised above the floodplains, its surface packed hard and shaded by trees planted at regular intervals. Every few miles, a sarai offered shelter, a walled compound with a well, a small mosque, a room where you could spread your bedroll and listen to the stories of other travellers. People from places you would never see, speaking languages you barely understood. The markets. Even now you can almost smell them. Cumin and coriander ground fresh on stone slabs, the sharp tang of them catching in the back of your throat. Mangoes in summer, so ripe that juice runs down your chin, no matter how careful you are. Attar of roses in tiny glass vials, the oil so concentrated that a single drop lasts all day, clinging to your clothes and your skin and the air around you. The bazaars of Agra and Delhi and Lahore were not just places to buy things, they were entire worlds, layered and noisy and beautiful, where you could find silk from China and ivory from Africa and spices from the Malabar coast, carpets from Persia so intricate that a single square foot might contain 1,000 knots. The merchants sat cross-legged on raised platforms, their goods spread before them on white cloths, and they did not shout. They spoke in low, patient voices, as if the transaction itself were a kind of dance, each step negotiated in advance. Above the noise of the crowd, camels lowing, brass bells chiming, a holy man calling for alms, a flute sometimes rose, or a sarangi, someone who had put aside his business for a moment to make the world a little more beautiful. In the evenings, when the heat finally broke and the sky turned the colour of a ripe peach, the courtyards filled with light. Not electric light, harsh and flat, but the soft, flickering glow of oil lamps and beeswax candles, each flame a small, trembling star reflected in the eyes of those who gathered nearby. In the palaces, that light fell on walls covered in intricate plasterwork, flowers and vines that seemed to grow and curl as the flames moved. Carpets from Herat and Lahore covered the floors, and on them, cushions of embroidered velvet invited guests to sit and listen. And what they listened to was poetry. The great Persian poets, Hafiz, Rumi, Saadi, their verses recited in voices that rose and fell like the tide, each line a small door opening onto a larger truth. The words were old even then, passed down through generations, but they felt new each time. The human heart, after all, does not change very much, no matter how many centuries pass. The emperor who gathered all of this into something like a single vision was named Jalal-ud-Din Muhammad Akbar, though most people called him simply Akbar, a word that means great, and which he earned not through conquest alone, but through something rarer, something quieter. He was not a tall man, by the accounts of those who saw him. Not particularly handsome, but there was something about his presence that drew the eye and held it. Broad shoulders, a chest that seemed built for armour, though in his later years he rarely wore any, preferring simple cotton robes of white or pale cream. His beard was thick and dark, trimmed short in the manner of the Central Asian warriors from whom he was descended, and his eyes were the colour of old honey, watchful and still, as if they had seen so much already that very little could surprise them anymore. The most remarkable thing about him, though, was not his appearance. It was his mind. He could not read. He had never been taught as a child, and by the time he might have learned, he had decided that he preferred the living voice to the written word. So he had others read to him, every day, for hours at a time, from books brought from every corner of the known world, histories and poetry, philosophical treatises and religious texts. He listened to everything, and he forgot nothing. His memory was extraordinary, almost frightening in its completeness. He could recall a conversation from 20 years before, word for word, including the expressions on the faces of those who had spoken. He could name the horses in his stables, their lineage and colour and disposition, without consulting any record. And he could sit for hours in his library, surrounded by books he could not read, listening to the voices of scholars and mystics and storytellers, his head tilted slightly to one side, his eyes half closed, absorbing knowledge the way dry earth absorbs rain. He had come to the throne as a boy, 13 years old, after the sudden death of his father Humayun. The empire he inherited was not the vast, stable realm it would later become, but something far more fragile. A collection of territories held together by little more than the memory of his grandfather Babur, the first Mughal emperor, who had swept down from the mountains of Central Asia and seized control of northern India. Between Babur's reign and Akbar's, the empire had nearly collapsed. Humayun had been driven from his throne by a rival, forced to wander as an exile for 15 years, and had only regained his kingdom shortly before his death. When the 13-year-old Akbar was proclaimed emperor, many of his advisors expected the empire to fall apart entirely, to dissolve into the same chaos of warring factions that had consumed the region for centuries. But the boy surprised them. Perhaps it was his patience, that quality that would define his entire reign, or perhaps it was something else. A quiet confidence that came from knowing that time was on his side, that the world moved slowly, and that empires were built not in a single season, but over many years. He did not rush to conquer or to punish. Instead, he listened. He gathered the wise men of his court around him, old warriors and seasoned administrators, and he asked them questions, one after another, until he understood not only the shape of his empire, but its weaknesses and its strengths. And then, slowly, gently, he began to rebuild. The world he was stepping into was a place of remarkable diversity. In the cities, you would hear a dozen languages spoken on a single street. Persian, the language of the court; Arabic, the language of religion and law; Hindevi, the language of the common people; and countless regional dialects, each with its own music and rhythm. The people dressed differently too, some in the flowing robes of Central Asia, others in the simple cotton dhotis of the south, others still in the bright silks of Gujarat and Bengal. And they worshipped differently. The majority followed the many gods of the Hindu tradition, while a significant minority offered prayers to Allah 5 times each day. There were Jains who swept the ground before them to avoid harming any living creature, Buddhists who meditated in forest monasteries, Zoroastrians who kept sacred fires burning in quiet temples. Even a few Christians, mostly traders and missionaries, who spoke of a prophet from a distant land called Palestine. It was into this world, of many faiths and many peoples, that Akbar had been born, and it was this world, in all its complexity and beauty, that he would come to love. Not as a king loves his kingdom, for the wealth it brings or the power it confers, but as a gardener loves a garden, for the variety of its flowers, for the way light falls differently on each leaf, for the patient work of tending something that will outlast him. He did not try to make the world simple. He did not try to make it uniform. He simply accepted it as it was, vast and strange and beautiful, and he did his best to hold it all together, not with force, but with something softer, something more patient. To understand what Akbar inherited, you have to understand his father first. Humayun, a man whose reign was less like the steady flow of a river and more like the flickering of a lamp in a high wind. He had inherited an empire from his father Babur, the brilliant and reckless founder of the Mughal dynasty. But he had not inherited Babur's luck or his military instincts. In 1540, just 10 years after becoming emperor, Humayun was defeated decisively by a rival named Sher Shah Suri, a man of extraordinary ability who had risen from humble origins to command the loyalty of the Afghan chieftains of the eastern provinces. And so Humayun fled, not like a king retreating to regroup, but like a man running for his life. He had nothing left but a small band of loyal followers and his pregnant wife, Hamida Banu Begum, who rode beside him through the desert heat while the dust of their pursuers hung on the horizon behind them. For 15 years he wandered, finding shelter first in the court of the Persian emperor, where he was received with kindness but treated as a guest, not a king. Then in various small kingdoms whose rulers offered him hospitality but never quite enough soldiers to reclaim his throne. It was a long, slow exile, measured not in battles won, but in days endured. Each morning brought the same question: would this be the day he gave up, accepted his fate, and let the dream of empire fade into the quiet disappointment of a life unfinished? But he did not give up. He kept going, carrying the weight of a lost kingdom through 15 years of wandering, until finally, in 1555, he gathered enough strength to march back into India and recapture Delhi. And then, less than a year later, he died, falling down the steep stone steps of his own library. A sudden and senseless end to a life that had already known so much senseless loss. The empire he left behind was not the one his father had built, nor the one his son would build. It was something fragile and incomplete. A half-finished house whose walls were still soft and whose foundation had not yet settled. Into this uncertain world stepped a boy of 13, Jalal-ud-Din Muhammad Akbar. He had spent most of his childhood not in palaces, but in the dusty camps of his father's army, learning to ride before he could read and to shoot a bow before he could write his own name. His education had been haphazard at best, interrupted constantly by wars and flights and the practical necessities of survival. No one had taught him the shapes of letters or the rhythms of poetry. By the time he was old enough to feel the lack of these things, he had decided, perhaps wisely, that he did not need them. What he had instead was a mind like a steel trap, quick and precise, and capable of holding vast amounts of information without apparent effort. He could listen to a long and complex argument, follow each turn of logic, remember every detail, and then, hours later, repeat it back verbatim, as if he had memorized it not by effort, but by simple exposure. This was not a skill he had been taught, nor one he had practiced deliberately. It was simply how his mind worked, a gift of nature that would prove more valuable than any number of books. His advisors, many of them learned men from Persia and Central Asia, were initially alarmed by the young emperor's illiteracy. They whispered among themselves that a king who could not read could not truly rule, that he would be dependent on others for knowledge and therefore vulnerable to manipulation. But they soon discovered that Akbar had no intention of being dependent on anyone. He did not need to read because he had perfected the art of listening, and he did not need to write because he had secretaries who could capture his words as he spoke them, quickly and accurately, their pens moving across the page like the wings of a moth against a lantern. The empire would be governed not by letters and documents, not by the dry record of ink on paper, but by the living voice of the emperor himself, a voice that spoke slowly and thoughtfully, weighing each word as if it were a stone being placed in a wall. The ceremony of his accession took place in a garden outside Kalanur, a small town in the Punjab, far from the great cities and their grand traditions. There was no elaborate throne, no canopy of silk embroidered with gold, no procession of elephants draped in velvet and pearls. Instead, there was a simple carpet spread on the grass, and on it, a young boy dressed in the plain white robes that his father had favoured, sitting cross-legged while the nobles of the court approached one by one to offer their allegiance. Some of these men were old enough to be his grandfather, veterans of Babur's campaigns, their faces scarred by swords, their beards gone grey in service to the dynasty. They knelt before the boy, touching their foreheads to the ground, and when they rose, there were tears in some of their eyes. Not tears of joy exactly, but something more complicated. The grief of men who had watched one emperor die and now saw another, so young and so unprepared, placed in a position that would test every ounce of his strength. Akbar showed no fear. He sat very still, his hands resting on his knees, his dark eyes moving slowly across the faces of the men who knelt before him. He did not smile, he did not frown. He simply watched and waited and let them see that he was not afraid. The empire he inherited was, by any reasonable measure, a disaster waiting to happen. It consisted of little more than the region around Delhi and Agra, a narrow strip of territory controlled by a handful of nobles whose loyalty was uncertain at best. To the east, the Afghan chieftains who had served Sher Shah Suri had re-established their own kingdoms and were preparing to march on the Mughal capital. To the west, the emperor's half-brother, a restless and ambitious man named Mirza Hakim, had seized control of Kabul and was threatening to invade from the mountains. To the south, the powerful kingdoms of Malwa and Gujarat watched the Mughal confusion with interest, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. To the north, the great fortress of Chunar, which controlled the trade routes along the Ganges, remained in the hands of an Afghan rebel who refused to acknowledge the authority of any Mughal. The young emperor was surrounded by enemies on every side. Many of his own advisors believed that the empire would not survive the year. They advised him to retreat, to consolidate his forces in the Punjab, to wait for a better moment before attempting to reclaim what his father had lost. But Akbar, who was 13 years old and had spent his entire childhood running from one crisis to another, had had enough of waiting. He told his advisors, quietly and firmly, that he intended to march on Delhi, to reclaim the capital, to remind the world that the Mughals were not finished yet. The campaign that followed was not a single battle, but a long, slow process of retaking one fortress after another. Each siege required patience and cunning, and a willingness to endure conditions that would have broken most men. Akbar led his army in person, riding at the head of his cavalry, sleeping on the ground beside his soldiers, sharing their food and their hardships. He was young, yes, but he was also strong, and he had learned from his father's failures that an emperor who stayed safely in his palace while his men fought and died would never command their loyalty. So he was there, always, in the heat and the dust and the rain, his white robes stained with mud, his face browned by the sun, asking questions, giving orders, and slowly, inexorably, pushing his enemies back. The first great test came at the Second Battle of Panipat, fought in November 1556, just a year after his accession. The enemy was Hemu, a brilliant Hindu general who had served the Afghan kings and who now saw an opportunity to seize the throne for himself. Hemu had gathered an enormous army, complete with 1,000 elephants whose thick hides were covered in iron armour. He marched on Delhi with the confidence of a man who had never lost a battle. Akbar's generals urged caution. They suggested waiting for reinforcements before engaging such a formidable force. But the young emperor, still only 14 years old, looked at the map, then looked at his generals, and said, very simply, that they would fight now. Today, because waiting would only give Hemu time to grow stronger. The armies met on the same plain where Akbar's grandfather Babur had won his own great victory 30 years before. The battle was long and terrible, thousands of men falling on both sides, the elephants, maddened by arrows and fire, trampling their own soldiers as often as they trampled the enemy. At a critical moment, when the Mughal line was beginning to waver, an arrow struck Hemu in the eye. He fell from his howdah, unconscious and bleeding. His army, seeing their leader fall, lost heart and scattered. The battle was won. Akbar, who had watched the entire engagement from a safe distance, as his generals had insisted, rode onto the field afterward and looked at the bodies of the dead. Then he looked at his own hands, which were clean and whole. He said nothing at all. But something in his eyes changed that day. Something that would never quite change back. In the years that followed, Akbar grew from a boy into a man, and the empire grew with him. He became tall, broad-shouldered and strong, with the kind of physical presence that made people stop talking when he entered a room. He kept his beard trimmed short in the Persian style and wore his hair long, gathered at the back of his neck with a simple leather cord. His clothes remained plain, white cotton in summer, soft wool in winter, with no jewels or gold thread to mark his rank. He did not need such things. Everyone already knew who he was, and those who did not know would learn very quickly from the way he carried himself, the way he moved through the world as if he had been born to occupy exactly the space he was in. He still could not read, but he had surrounded himself with men who could. Every evening, after the business of the day was finished, he would sit in his private chambers while a scholar read aloud from some new book, some old poem, some religious text brought from a distant land. He listened to everything, and he forgot nothing. Over time, his mind became a kind of living library, filled with the knowledge of 1,000 sources, all of it cross-referenced and connected in ways that no written document could ever capture. His first years on the throne taught him that the old ways of ruling would not work in this new world. His grandfather Babur had been a conqueror, a man who swept down from the mountains with an army of hard-eyed horsemen and simply took what he wanted. His father Humayun had been a survivor, a man who clung to power by his fingertips, never quite secure, never quite trusted. But Akbar wanted to be something different. He wanted to be a builder, not a destroyer. He wanted to create an empire that would last, not for his lifetime, but for centuries. And he understood, perhaps more clearly than any ruler of his age, that an empire built on fear would crumble as soon as the fear was gone. So he began to experiment with new ways of governing, new ways of relating to the diverse peoples who lived within his borders. He married a Rajput princess, the daughter of a powerful Hindu king, and he did not ask her to convert to Islam or to abandon her own traditions. Instead, he celebrated her festivals alongside his own, lighting lamps at Diwali, feasting at Holi, showing his Hindu subjects that their emperor respected their faith and valued their loyalty. He welcomed Hindu nobles into his court, not as second-class citizens but as equals, giving them commands in his army and appointments in his administration. He abolished the jizya, the tax that non-Muslims had been required to pay for centuries, because he believed that it created a division between him and his people that he did not want to exist. And he began to ask questions, deep and searching questions about the nature of God and faith and the meaning of human existence. Questions that would lead him down paths that no Mughal emperor had ever travelled before. His court at Agra was never quiet. From dawn until well past dusk, the palace hummed with the sound of voices, the rustle of papers, the footsteps of messengers running from one department to another. The emperor's day began before sunrise, with prayers offered in the small private mosque that his father had built overlooking the river. He prayed in the Muslim manner, bowing and prostrating himself on a simple carpet, but he did not always pray alone. Sometimes a Hindu noble would be waiting outside, or a Jain monk who had travelled for weeks to seek an audience, or a Christian priest from Goa who had brought a new translation of the Gospels to show the emperor. Akbar welcomed them all, and he listened to their prayers as he listened to everything else, with patience and curiosity and a deep, abiding respect for the sincerity of their beliefs. After prayers came breakfast, a simple meal of flatbread and fruit and yogurt, eaten quickly while his secretaries read aloud the reports that had come in during the night. There were always reports. From the governors of distant provinces, from the commanders of border fortresses, from the spies who travelled the roads in disguise and sent back information about the movements of rival kings. Akbar listened to all of it, his eyes half closed, his fingers tapping slowly on the arm of his chair. Then he would issue his orders, speaking in a calm, unhurried voice that gave no indication of the complexity of the decisions he was making. Then came the darbar, the public audience, when the emperor sat in a great hall open to the air on three sides, and anyone with a petition or a complaint could approach and speak their piece. The hall was not decorated with gold or precious stones. Instead, there were carved screens of white marble that filtered the morning light into patterns of lace and shadow, and fountains that ran along marble channels, their cool water murmuring in the background like a second conversation. The emperor sat on a low platform covered with white cushions, his legs crossed beneath him, his hands resting on his knees. He did not sit on a throne or wear a crown. He had come to believe that such things created distance between himself and his people, and distance, he had learned, was the enemy of good governance. So he sat as a man sits, not as a god. When a farmer came forward to complain about a corrupt tax collector, or a widow asked for justice against a neighbour who had stolen her land, or a merchant sought permission to open a new trade route through the mountains, the emperor listened to each of them with the same attention he would give to a visiting king. When he had heard enough, he would turn to his advisors and ask for their counsel. Then he would make his decision, speaking slowly and clearly so that everyone in the hall could hear. The afternoon was for hunting, or for riding, or for walking through the gardens he had planted along the riverbank. Akbar loved the outdoors. He loved the feeling of wind on his face and sun on his skin, and he spent as much time as possible away from the enclosed spaces of the palace. He was a skilled huntsman, patient and precise, but he did not hunt for sport alone. He used his hunting expeditions as a way of learning the land, of meeting the people who lived in the villages and forests, of understanding the geography that would determine the movements of armies and the flow of trade. He knew the rivers of his empire better than any mapmaker. He knew where they ran deep and where they ran shallow, where they flooded in the monsoon and where they shrank to muddy streams in the dry season. He knew the passes through the mountains, the routes across the deserts, the fords where an army could cross a river without building bridges. And he knew the people too. The farmers who grew the wheat and rice that fed his cities, the herders who drove their cattle from one grazing ground to another, the merchants who carried salt and silk and spices along the ancient roads. He spoke to them in their own languages, or through interpreters when he could not, and he asked them the same questions he asked his scholars and generals. What do you need? What do you fear? What would make your life better? He listened to their answers, and he remembered them, and he tried, as best he could, to build an empire that would serve the people who lived in it, not the other way round. The evening brought him back to the palace, where the business of government continued in a quieter form. He met with his closest advisors, the men who had been with him since those first uncertain days in Kalinor, and they discussed the matters that could not be addressed in the public darbar. The plots and counterplots, the alliances and betrayals, the delicate negotiations with neighbouring kingdoms that required secrecy and patience. These meetings took place in a small room at the top of a tower, a room with windows on all four sides, so that the emperor could see the sun set over the river and the stars emerge one by one in the deepening blue. The walls of the room were covered with paintings, not religious scenes or battle scenes, but portraits of the people Akbar loved. His wives, his children, his friends, the poets and musicians and holy men who had enriched his life. He would look at these paintings sometimes during the meetings, his eyes moving slowly from one face to another, and his advisors learned to wait when his attention drifted. They knew that the emperor was not distracted. He was thinking, remembering, drawing on the vast store of knowledge and memory that lived behind his calm and watchful eyes. The empire grew, year by year, not through a single great conquest, but through a patient process of annexation and alliance. Akbar took back the cities his father had lost: Delhi, Agra, Lahore, Multan, and then he pushed beyond them, into the fertile plains of Gujarat, into the hill fortresses of Rajasthan, into the rich kingdoms of Malwa and Bengal. Each campaign was different, requiring different strategies and different kinds of patience. Against some enemies, he used overwhelming force, crushing their armies in a single decisive battle. Against others, he used diplomacy, offering favourable terms of surrender and generous pensions to kings who agreed to accept Mughal overlordship. Against still others, he used time itself, waiting for his enemies to wear themselves out with their own internal conflicts, and then moving in quietly when they were too exhausted to resist. He was never in a hurry, never desperate, never willing to sacrifice long-term stability for short-term gain. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the scattered territories that had once been a patchwork of warring kingdoms began to cohere into something new, something unified, something that could properly be called an empire. By the time he was 30, Akbar ruled a realm that stretched from the mountains of Afghanistan to the delta of the Ganges, from the deserts of Rajasthan to the forests of Bihar. It was the largest and wealthiest empire in the history of India, and it was still growing. But the emperor did not rest. He did not celebrate his achievements or retire to a life of ease. Instead, he kept working, kept asking questions, kept searching for better ways to govern, better ways to bring justice and prosperity to the millions of people who now called him their ruler. He reformed the tax system, replacing the old arbitrary assessments with a rational system based on careful measurements of land and crop yields. He reorganized the military, creating a system of ranks and salaries that rewarded loyalty and competence rather than birth or connections. He standardized weights and measures, built roads and canals, established schools and hospitals, and created a postal system that could carry messages from one end of his empire to the other in a matter of days. Through it all, he remained the same calm, patient, curious man he had been as a boy. Listening, learning, adapting, never quite satisfied, but never quite discouraged. Moving forward at his own steady pace, like a river flowing inexorably toward the sea. The court of Akbar was a living organism, vast and intricate, breathing and moving and pulsing with a rhythm all its own. To understand it, you have to imagine not a single place, but many places layered one upon another, like the pages of a manuscript written over centuries. At its heart was the emperor himself, seated on a low platform covered with white cushions, his legs crossed beneath him in the posture of a man who had learned long ago to be comfortable in his own body. But around him, arranged in concentric circles that extended outward through courtyards and gardens and audience halls, were thousands of other people. Each had a specific role and a specific place in the invisible architecture of power. The closest circle belonged to the emperor's personal servants, men who had known him since childhood and who attended to his smallest needs. Bringing him water, adjusting the cushions behind his back, holding a silk cloth to catch the dust that rose from the floor. Beyond them sat the great nobles, the amirs and khans, who commanded armies and governed provinces. Their turbans were wrapped in the distinctive styles of their homelands, and their jewelled daggers glinted in the light that fell through the carved marble screens. Beyond them, spilling out through the doorways and into the courtyards beyond, stood the lesser nobles, the clerks and secretaries, the soldiers and messengers, the petitioners and merchants and holy men who had come to seek the emperor's favour or to present a grievance, or simply to witness the spectacle of power made visible. The air in the hall was never still. It moved constantly with the rustle of silk robes and the whisper of sandals on stone and the low murmur of voices speaking in Persian and Hindavi and Turkish and Arabic, all of it rising and falling like the breathing of some great animal resting in the shade. The day began long before the sun appeared, in the deep blue darkness that precedes the dawn. The only sounds were the call of a night bird from the riverbank and the soft footsteps of the guards changing shifts on the palace walls. Akbar slept lightly, by all accounts, and woke easily. He would open his eyes in the darkness, without the groggy confusion that afflicts ordinary men. For a moment he would lie still, listening to the silence, feeling the cool air on his face. Then he would rise and wash himself with water that had been heated over a small charcoal brazier and poured into a brass basin by a servant who had learned to move without sound. His clothes were laid out the night before, white cotton in summer, soft wool in winter, always plain, always clean, without embroidery or ornament except for a single ring on his right hand, a small sapphire set in silver that had belonged to his father. He dressed himself, refusing assistance even when his fingers were stiff with cold or his shoulders sore from the previous day's riding. Then he walked alone through the darkened corridors to the small mosque that Humayun had built overlooking the river. The mosque was barely more than a room, with a niche in the wall that pointed toward Mecca and a simple carpet on the floor worn thin by the knees of generations of worshippers. Here, in the silence before the world woke, Akbar performed his dawn prayers, bowing and prostrating himself in the ancient rhythm that Muslims had followed for nearly 1,000 years, his forehead touching the carpet as the first pale light began to seep through the latticed windows. After prayers came breakfast, eaten alone or sometimes with a few close companions who had learned that the emperor preferred conversation to silence during this hour. The meal was simple: flatbread still warm from the griddle, a bowl of yogurt mixed with chopped cucumber and mint, fresh fruit when it was in season, a small cup of sweet tea that had been brought from the mountains of Kashmir. He ate slowly, chewing each bite with the same deliberate attention he gave to everything else, and as he ate, he listened. His secretaries read aloud the reports that had arrived during the night. Messages from the governors of distant provinces, intelligence from the spies who watched the borders, petitions from nobles who sought appointments or favours. Sometimes the news was good, a successful harvest in Bengal, a new trade route opened through the mountains, a rebellion put down without bloodshed. Sometimes it was bad, a drought in Gujarat, a raid by bandits on a caravan road, a dispute between two powerful nobles that threatened to escalate into open conflict. Akbar listened to all of it without changing expression, his dark eyes fixed on some middle distance that seemed to contain both the present and the future simultaneously. Then he would give his orders in that calm, unhurried voice that his secretaries had learned to write down word for word, never adding or subtracting, because the emperor's words were the law, and the law did not tolerate improvisation. The hierarchy of the Mughal court was extraordinarily complex. A ladder with 1,000 rungs, each one representing a precise position in the order of power and prestige. At the top, directly below the emperor himself, sat the great nobles, men who commanded 10,000 cavalry or more. Men who governed provinces the size of small kingdoms. Men whose annual revenues exceeded the treasuries of most independent rulers. These men were not born to their positions, as a rule. They earned them through loyalty and competence and the subtle art of being useful to the emperor when he needed them most. Many had started as ordinary soldiers, rising through the ranks one campaign at a time, accumulating wealth and influence until they stood among the highest in the land. Others came from royal families themselves, princes of conquered kingdoms who had chosen submission over destruction, and who had been rewarded with ranks and revenues that preserved their dignity while binding them firmly to the Mughal state. Below them were the middle nobles, the commanders of 1,000 or 2,000 horsemen, men who governed smaller provinces or served as deputies to the greater nobles, men who aspired to rise but had not yet reached the summit. Below them were the lesser nobles, the commanders of 100 or 200 horsemen. The backbone of the imperial administration, the men who collected taxes and maintained order and commanded the small garrisons that dotted the empire like stars in a clear night sky. This system was called the Mansabdari system, from the Persian word mansab, meaning rank or position. It was perhaps Akbar's most brilliant innovation, the mechanism that held his vast and diverse empire together across thousands of miles and dozens of cultures. Every mansabdar, every holder of a rank, was assigned a specific number of horsemen that he was required to maintain and bring to battle when the emperor called. In return, he received a salary paid from the imperial treasury, or more commonly, the right to collect taxes from a specific parcel of land, keeping a portion for himself and forwarding the rest to the central government. But the genius of the system lay not in its economics. It lay in its flexibility, the way it allowed the emperor to reward loyalty and punish disloyalty without the destructive drama of executions or confiscations. A noble who pleased the emperor could have his mansab increased, gaining more horsemen, more revenue, more prestige. A noble who displeased him could have his mansab decreased, losing rank and income and status, slipping down the ladder while others rose past him. Because the system applied to everyone equally, to Hindus and Muslims, to Persians and Indians, to the sons of conquered kings and the grandsons of weavers, it created a common framework within which all ambition could be channeled and controlled. No one was born into a mansab, and no one died with one permanently attached to his name. Rank was a loan from the emperor, a gift that could be given and taken away. Every noble knew that his position depended entirely on his continued usefulness to the man who sat on the low platform covered with white cushions. After breakfast and the morning reports, the emperor moved to the Diwan-i-Am, the hall of public audience, where the business of the empire was conducted in plain view of anyone who cared to watch. The hall was vast, open on three sides to the air and the light, its roof supported by rows of sandstone columns carved with flowers and geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change as the sun moved across the sky. At the far end, facing the entrance, stood the Jarocca, a carved stone balcony from which the emperor could show himself to his people each morning. This ritual had become so important to the public imagination that farmers would walk for days to catch a single glimpse of their ruler's face. The appearance of the emperor at the Jarocca was a moment of profound significance, not because it conveyed any specific information or issued any particular command, but because it reminded everyone who saw it that the empire was not an abstraction. It was not a map on a piece of paper. It was a living thing, embodied in the person of a man who rose each morning and washed his face and said his prayers, just like the rest of humanity. The crowd below would press forward, straining to see, and when the emperor appeared, always in white, always calm, always looking out at them with those dark, watchful eyes, a murmur would run through the crowd like wind through a field of wheat. A sound that was not quite a cheer, but something softer, something more like relief. He was there. He was still there. The world, for another day, was still in order. From the Jarocca, the emperor proceeded to the Diwan-i-Am proper, where he took his seat on the low platform, and the real business of the day began. Petitioners approached in order of precedence, starting with the highest nobles and working down through the ranks, until finally, in the afternoon, the common people were allowed to present their grievances. The scene was one of controlled chaos, a swirling mass of humanity, held in check by the invisible force of the emperor's attention. Men in jeweled turbans and silk robes bowed and stepped backward, never turning their backs on the throne. Clerks in white cotton sat cross-legged on the floor, their ink pots and reed pens arranged before them, recording every word that was spoken. Guards in chainmail stood at intervals along the walls, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords, watching the crowd with eyes that missed nothing. Through it all moved the ushers, the Khwaja-Sarais, eunuchs in long robes who had been trained from childhood to remember the face and rank of every noble in the empire. They could guide a newcomer to his proper place without a word spoken, simply by the pressure of a hand on an elbow or a slight inclination of the head. The sound of the hall was a low, continuous murmur, punctuated by the sharp crack of a staff on the floor when the emperor wished for silence. A signal that passed through the room like a ripple in a pond, spreading outward until every voice was still and every eye was turned toward the platform. The role of the Diwan, the chief financial minister, was perhaps the most demanding in the entire court. It required not only mathematical brilliance, but also a deep understanding of human nature and the patience of a saint. The Diwan sat to the emperor's right hand, a position of honor that also placed him closest to the flow of information and the weight of responsibility. His day began before dawn and ended long after dark, and his work was never finished, never complete, because the empire was always growing and changing and demanding new calculations and new assessments. He was responsible for the collection of all imperial revenues, the payment of all imperial salaries, the maintenance of all imperial accounts, and the resolution of all disputes that arose from the complex interactions of the Mansabdari system. His staff numbered in the hundreds, perhaps thousands. Clerks and accountants, men trained from childhood in the arts of arithmetic and calligraphy. They could calculate the revenue of a village from the records of its crop yields and the prices at the local market. They could trace the flow of a single coin through a dozen transactions and determine whether it had been properly accounted for at each step. The Diwan's office was a labyrinth of rooms and corridors, every surface covered with papers and ledgers and rolls of parchment. The air was thick with the smell of ink and dust, and the low murmur of voices counting. Always counting, because the empire was built on numbers, and the numbers could not be allowed to lie. But the Diwan was more than a bookkeeper. He was also the emperor's eyes and ears in the financial world. The man who knew which nobles were growing too rich and which were growing too poor. Which provinces were flourishing and which were declining. Which merchants were hoarding grain and which were distributing it fairly. He sat in on the emperor's private councils, offering advice on matters of state that had nothing to do with money. Because money, as Akbar had learned, was connected to everything else. The man who understood the flow of revenue understood the flow of power. The Diwan's reports were read aloud to the emperor each evening after the public business was finished, and Akbar would listen to the numbers with the same careful attention he gave to poetry or philosophy. His eyes half closed, his fingers tapping slowly on the arm of his chair. He did not love numbers, perhaps, but he respected them. He understood that they were a language for describing the world, and he had learned to read that language through the voice of the man who sat to his right hand. The man whose reed pen moved across the page like a river moving across a plain, carving channels of order out of the chaos of human activity. The afternoons at court were quieter, a time for smaller meetings and more intimate conversations, when the emperor withdrew from the public hall to the private chambers where he could speak freely with his closest advisors. These chambers were not luxurious, not by the standards of other kings and emperors, but they were beautiful in a quiet, understated way that reflected the tastes of the man who inhabited them. The walls were covered with paintings, not of battles or hunting scenes, but of flowers and birds and landscapes. Images that invited the eye to rest rather than to search. The floors were covered with thick carpets from Herat, woven in patterns of deep red and blue that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. In the centre of the main room, surrounded by cushions and low tables, stood a large brass brazier where a fire burned in the winter months, its light flickering across the faces of the men who gathered around it. Here, in this space, the formal hierarchies of the court were set aside. The emperor spoke to his advisors as equals, asking for their honest opinions and promising not to punish them for disagreement. He did not always keep this promise. He was human after all, and had a human's capacity for irritation and wounded pride. But he tried, and his advisors learned to speak their minds while watching his face for the subtle signs of displeasure that preceded a sudden change in mood. The smell of the court was complex, a mixture of many different scents that combined into something unique and unforgettable. The sharp, clean smell of rosewater, sprinkled on the floors each morning to settle the dust and cool the air. The warm, resinous smell of sandalwood burned in small brass censers that hung from the ceiling on chains, their smoke rising in thin spirals that caught the light and seemed to write messages on the air. The earthy smell of river, clay that clung to the robes of petitioners who had walked for days along the muddy banks of the Yamuna. The sweet, heavy smell of marigold blossoms strung into garlands that hung from the columns and doorways, their petals slowly drying and falling to the floor in a carpet of orange and gold. The sharp, pungent smell of spices that merchants brought as gifts, cardamom from the hills of Kerala, cinnamon from the coast of Sri Lanka, saffron from the fields of Kashmir, each one releasing its essence into the air when a pod was crushed or a thread was rubbed between two fingers. Beneath all of these, there was the smell of the people themselves. Hundreds of bodies crowded into a confined space, their sweat and their breath and their skin contributing to an olfactory symphony that changed from hour to hour and season to season. It was not a clean smell, not a sterile smell, but it was a human smell, a living smell, and the emperor, who had grown up in camps and on battlefields, found it comforting rather than offensive. The texture of court life was defined by waiting, the long, patient pauses that separated one event from the next. A noble seeking an audience might wait for hours, or days, sitting on a stone bench in a courtyard, watching the shadows crawl across the floor, listening to the splashing of fountains and the distant sound of musicians practicing in some unseen room. A petitioner with a grievance might wait for weeks, sleeping in the open air with other hopefuls, eating bread and onions bought from vendors who set up their stalls just outside the palace gates. Even the emperor waited. For reports to arrive from distant provinces, for messengers to return with answers from neighbouring kings, for the seasons to turn and the rivers to rise and the crops to grow. Time moved differently in the Mughal court, not faster or slower than it moves anywhere else, but with a different rhythm, a different emphasis. There was no rushing, no hurry, no sense that anything important would be lost if it took a little longer than expected. The empire was vast, and the world was patient, and the things that mattered most, loyalty, trust, the slow accumulation of wisdom, could not be rushed even if you tried. The evening darbar was smaller than the morning audience, more intimate, attended only by the highest nobles and the emperor's most trusted advisors. It took place in a different hall, the Diwani Khas, the hall of private audience, a circular room with a single pillar in the centre, from which 4 walkways radiated outward to the corners of the room. The emperor sat on the pillar, or rather on a platform that encircled it, while his nobles stood on the walkways, or sat on cushions placed at the edges of the room. The effect was strange and beautiful. The emperor, elevated, but not isolated, present in every part of the room at once, his voice carrying clearly to each corner without the need for shouting or repetition. Here, in this space, the real business of the empire was conducted, the discussions of strategy and diplomacy, the negotiations of marriages and alliances, the decisions about war and peace that would determine the fate of millions. The emperor spoke less in these sessions than he did in the public audience. He had learned that the best way to hear the truth was to say very little and let others fill the silence with their opinions and their fears and their carefully disguised ambitions. He listened to them argue, watched them maneuver, noted who spoke in favour of peace and who argued for war, who defended a rival and who attacked an enemy. When he had heard enough, he would speak, softly and slowly, and his words would end the discussion and become the law. That was what it meant to be the emperor, the axis around which the entire world of the court revolved. The night brought finally a kind of peace, a release from the demands and pressures of the day. The emperor would eat a light meal, soup perhaps, or rice cooked with vegetables and mild spices, and then he would walk in the gardens that his gardeners had planted along the riverbank. The same gardens he had walked in as a young man, when the weight of the empire had felt almost unbearable, and he had come here to remind himself that there was beauty in the world, that life was not only about power and responsibility, but also about the scent of jasmine on the night air, and the sound of water moving over stones. Sometimes he walked alone, his hands clasped behind his back, his head bowed in thought. Sometimes he walked with a friend, a poet or a musician or a holy man, someone who could remind him that there were other ways of measuring a life besides the number of provinces conquered or the amount of revenue collected. Sometimes he simply stood at the edge of the river, looking out at the dark water, listening to the small sounds of the night, the croaking of frogs, the chirping of crickets, the distant bark of a jackal somewhere in the darkness. The river was always there, always moving, always carrying something from somewhere to somewhere else. The emperor found in its steady, unhurried flow a kind of comfort, a reminder that he was part of something larger than himself, something that would continue long after he was gone. Beyond the walls of the court, beyond the red sandstone palaces and the marble audience halls, lay the real Mughal Empire. the villages and towns and trading posts where millions of ordinary people lived out their lives in the slow rhythm of seasons and harvests, births and deaths, morning prayers and evening meals. These people rarely saw the emperor. They never spoke to him. They knew him only as a name attached to the coins that passed through their hands and the soldiers who passed through their villages. Yet his reign shaped their lives in countless ways, large and small. The taxes they paid, the roads they walked, the safety they felt when night fell, and the bandits stayed hidden in their lairs. Most of them were farmers, working the fertile soil of the Gangetic Plain, where the river deposited fresh silt each year, and the monsoon rains came with reliable regularity. They rose before dawn, as the emperor himself rose, and went to the fields with their wooden ploughs and their patient oxen, breaking the earth and sowing the seeds that would become the wheat and rice and barley that fed the cities. Their hands were rough and calloused, their skin burned brown by the sun, their clothes simple cotton tunics that they washed in the river and wore until they fell apart. They did not think of themselves as part of an empire. Not really. They thought of themselves as members of a village, a family, a caste. The empire was a distant thing, like the weather or the movements of the stars, something that affected their lives but could not be controlled or changed by anything they might do. The farmers along the Yamuna knew the river as intimately as they knew their own wives and children. They knew where it ran deep and where it ran shallow, where the fish gathered in the spring and where the current swept strongest after the monsoon rains. They built small boats from hollowed logs, paddling out into the current to cast their nets or to carry produce to markets on the opposite bank. They dug canals from the river's edge, channeling water into their fields through a network of ditches that had been maintained by the same families for generations. When the river flooded, as it did each year with the melting snows of the Himalayas, they gathered their animals and their children and moved to higher ground. They waited for the waters to recede and the silt to settle, knowing that the flood would leave behind a layer of rich black soil that would double their harvest in the coming year. They did not curse the river for its floods. They understood that the floods were part of the river's nature, as inevitable as the sunrise and as necessary as the rain. The river gave, and the river took away. The farmer's job was to accept both with the same patient resignation, planting when the time came to plant and harvesting when the time came to harvest. Never rushing, never despairing, always trusting that the earth would provide if they did their part. Further east, in the humid lowlands of Bengal, the weavers of Dhaka produced muslin so fine that European travellers would later call it woven air and claim that a bolt of the cloth could pass through the ring of a finger. These weavers worked in small cottages, their bamboo looms set up in the shade of banyan trees, their fingers moving with a speed and precision that seemed almost inhuman. The cotton came from local fields, picked by hand in the cool of the morning when the bowls were still damp with dew. The women of the weaver families cleaned and carded the cotton, removing the seeds and teasing the fibres into long, soft ropes that could be spun into thread. The spinning itself was done on a simple wheel, turned by foot, while the spinner's hands guided the cotton onto a spindle, drawing it out thinner and thinner until it was barely visible against the dark interior of the cottage. Then the weaving began. The shuttle passing back and forth through the warp threads, each pass adding a fraction of an inch to the growing cloth. A single piece of muslin might take weeks or months to complete, depending on its fineness and the skill of the weaver. When it was finished, it would be folded carefully between layers of banana leaves and carried to the market, where merchants from as far away as Persia and Turkey would pay fortunes for the privilege of owning it. The weavers themselves saw little of this wealth. They lived on the edge of subsistence, their families surviving on rice and fish, and the occasional festival when someone would slaughter a goat or a chicken in honour of a wedding or a birth. But they took pride in their work. A quiet, deep pride that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the knowledge that their hands had made something beautiful, something that would outlast them, something that would be touched and admired by people they would never meet. The Grand Trunk Road ran through the heart of the empire, a ribbon of packed earth that stretched from the mouth of the Ganges in the east to the mountains of Afghanistan in the west. It carried merchants and soldiers and pilgrims and travellers of every description. The road was old, older than the Mughals, older than the Delhi Sultanate, older perhaps than the memory of any living person. It had been built and rebuilt 100 times, widened and straightened and planted with shade trees at regular intervals so that travellers could rest in the heat of the day. Akbar had improved it further, adding sarais at every stage, walled compounds with wells and mosques and sleeping rooms, where travellers could spend the night in safety and refresh themselves before continuing their journey. The merchants who used the road were a diverse and fascinating group. Men, and occasionally women, who had chosen a life of movement over the stability of a home. They knew the prices of goods in a dozen different cities and the exchange rates of a dozen different currencies. They travelled in caravans for safety, dozens of carts and pack animals moving together, their drivers calling out to each other in a half-dozen languages, their goods wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the dust and the occasional rain. The most successful merchants owned their own carts and their own animals, employing drivers and guards to accompany their goods while they themselves stayed in the cities, negotiating contracts and cultivating relationships with the powerful men who controlled the flow of trade. The less successful travelled on foot, carrying their wares on their backs or on the backs of a single donkey, hoping to buy low in one village and sell high in the next, living on the narrow margin between profit and loss. All of them, rich and poor alike, shared a common experience: the road itself, the endless horizon, the sense that the world was larger than any one place, and that there was always something new to see, something new to learn, something new to sell. The women of the Mughal Empire lived most of their lives within the walls of the zanana, the women's quarters that formed a separate world within every household of means. The zanana was not a prison, as some later travellers would imagine. It was a complex and self-contained society, with its own hierarchies and rituals and forms of power. The senior women, the mother of the household head, the first wife, the aunts and grandmothers, exercised real authority over the younger women, assigning tasks and settling disputes, and deciding which of the daughters would marry which of the sons of neighbouring families. They managed the household finances, supervised the servants, and maintained the networks of gift-giving and hospitality that bound families together across generations. They cooked and sewed and spun, but they also read and wrote and played musical instruments. In the wealthiest households, they received instruction from tutors in poetry and philosophy and the art of conversation. The younger women, particularly the new brides who had left their own families to join their husbands' households, spent their days learning the customs and rhythms of their new homes, watching the senior women for cues about what was expected and what was forbidden. They formed friendships that would last a lifetime, bonds of loyalty and affection that often proved stronger than the marriages that had brought them together. In the evenings, when the men returned from their work and the doors between the zanana and the rest of the house were opened for a few hours, the women would emerge to sit with their husbands and brothers and sons, to eat together and talk together and remind each other that they were all part of the same family, the same story, the same slow unfolding of generations. The children of the empire, like children everywhere, found ways to play and learn and grow despite the limitations of their circumstances. Boys from wealthy families attended the maktab, the primary school attached to the local mosque, where they learnt to read and write and recite passages from the Quran. Their teacher, the mullah, was a patient man, sometimes an impatient man, depending on his temperament and the hour of the day. He sat on a raised platform while his students sat on the floor before him, their wooden writing boards balanced on their knees. They learned to form the letters of the Persian alphabet with reed pens dipped in ink, made from soot and gum Arabic, their tongues protruding slightly with the effort of concentration. They learned to memorize long passages of poetry, repeating them over and over until the words became part of them, as familiar as the names of their brothers and sisters. They learned to sit still, to pay attention, to respect their elders, and obey their teachers. Lessons that would serve them well in later life when they entered the adult world of work and responsibility. The girls of the household were educated at home by their mothers and aunts. They learnt the practical skills of cooking and sewing and household management, but also, in many families, they learnt to read and write as well. There were women poets in the Mughal Empire, women scholars, women who corresponded with friends and relatives across great distances. Their education, informal though it was, gave them a window into a world larger than the walls of the Zanana. The children of farmers and weavers and merchants received less formal instruction. They learnt their parents' trades by watching and helping, absorbing the knowledge they would need to survive through the slow process of imitation and practice. They played in the dust, chased dogs and cats through the narrow lanes, climbed trees and swam in the rivers. They grew up, as children always grow up, too quickly for their parents' comfort, and too slowly for their own. The villages along the Yamuna were small, rarely more than a few hundred people. Each family lived in a house of mud brick with a thatched roof and a small courtyard where the women cooked and the children played and the chickens scratched for insects. The houses were clustered together for protection, surrounded by a low wall of thorn bushes that kept out the wild animals that roamed the countryside at night. Jackals and hyenas, and in some areas, the occasional tiger that had wandered down from the Himalayan foothills. The centre of the village was marked by a banyan tree, its broad leaves casting a dense shade even at midday. Under this tree, the men gathered in the evenings to smoke hookahs and discuss the events of the day. Here too, the village council met to settle disputes and allocate resources, a group of elders whose authority rested not on any official appointment, but on the respect they had earned through years of fair dealing and wise counsel. The village had its own gods and its own festivals, its own stories and its own songs. A culture that had evolved over centuries and would continue to evolve long after the Mughal Empire had faded into memory. The emperor in his palace at Agra was a distant figure, a name on a coin. But the village was real and present and immediate, and it was to the village that the farmers gave their loyalty. The village was where they were born and where they would die, and everything in between was simply the filling of the days until that final rest. The markets of the small towns were held once a week, on a day determined by local custom. Farmers and weavers and potters and blacksmiths would bring their goods to a central square and spread them out on blankets or woven mats. The air was filled with the sounds of bargaining, voices rising and falling in the ancient dance of buying and selling, each transaction a small negotiation that involved not only price, but also status and relationship, and the subtle art of saving face. A farmer selling a sack of wheat knew that the merchant buying it would resell it at a profit, so he adjusted his price accordingly, asking for a little more than he expected to receive, and accepting a little less than he had hoped. A weaver selling a length of cloth knew that the woman examining it would judge not only its quality, but also its beauty, so he pointed out the fineness of the weave and the brilliance of the colours with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who had made the same speech 100 times before. The children ran between the stalls, chasing each other and begging their parents for coins to buy sweets from the vendor, who sat at the edge of the square with his trays of sticky, honey-drenched pastries. The old men sat on a low wall at the edge of the square, watching it all with the calm, knowing eyes of those who had seen it all before and would see it all again. The market came every week, and the world, despite everything, continued to turn. For the ordinary people of the Mughal Empire, life was hard but not desperate, difficult but not without joy. There was hunger in the years when the rains failed, and disease when the rivers flooded, and death always, waiting in the shadows like a patient hunter. But there was also the warmth of a fire on a cold night, the taste of fresh bread dipped in yogurt, the sound of a lullaby sung by a mother to her child, the feeling of cool water on tired feet after a long day in the fields. There was the festival of Holi in the spring, when everyone threw coloured powder at everyone else, and the air turned pink and green and gold. The festival of Diwali in the autumn, when lamps were lit in every window and the darkness of the night seemed to retreat before the advance of so many small, brave flames. There was the call to prayer from the mosque, 5 times a day, a reminder that there was something larger than the self, something that gave meaning to the struggle and the suffering and the small, ordinary pleasures of being alive. And there was the river, always the river, carrying the waters from the mountains to the sea, carrying the boats and the fish and the reflections of the stars, carrying everything forward, slowly, gently, as rivers do, as time does, as life does, from one moment to the next, from one generation to the next, from one world to the next. In the year 1575, when Akbar was 33 years old, and his empire had grown to encompass most of northern India, he ordered the construction of a small building in his new capital of Fatehpur Sikri. The Ibadat Khana, the house of worship, was a simple structure by the standards of Mughal architecture. 4 walls, a domed roof, a series of arches that opened onto a courtyard where fountains played in stone channels. But its purpose was anything but simple. On Thursday evenings, the emperor gathered the religious scholars of his realm, the Muslim qazis and mullahs, the Hindu pandits, the Jain monks, the Zoroastrian priests. Eventually, even the Christian missionaries who had travelled from Goa in the hope of converting the most powerful man in India. They came to debate, to discuss, to argue about the nature of God and the path to salvation and the meaning of human existence. Akbar sat among them, listening, asking questions, challenging assumptions. Slowly, over years of these weekly gatherings, he developed a religious worldview that would astonish his contemporaries and confuse his successors. The Ibadat Khana was not a mosque, not a temple, not a church. It was something new, something that had never existed before in the history of Islamic empires. A space where different faiths could meet as equals, where the truth was not assumed to reside in any single tradition, but had to be discovered through the patient, respectful exchange of ideas. The emperor, who could not read, but who could listen better than anyone in his realm, sat at the centre of it all, his dark eyes moving from speaker to speaker, absorbing everything, forgetting nothing, slowly building in his mind a vision of God that was larger and more generous than any he had been taught as a child. The debates in the Ibadat Khana were not always peaceful, not always respectful, not always productive. The Muslim scholars, accustomed to centuries of dominance, resented being forced to sit on the same level as Hindus and Jains and Zoroastrians. People they had been taught were infidels whose beliefs were not merely wrong but dangerous. The Hindu pandits, for their part, were suspicious of the emperor's motives. They wondered whether this openness to other faiths was a trap, a way of luring them into arguments they could not win before punishing them for their presumption. The Jain monks, who had taken vows of non-violence that extended to the smallest insect, found themselves horrified by the casual cruelty of the Muslim scholars, who spoke of holy war and the slaughter of infidels as if such things were pleasing to God. The Christian missionaries, newly arrived from Europe, brought with them a zealous certainty that seemed out of place in the patient, curious atmosphere of the Ibadat Khana, a conviction that their faith alone held the keys to salvation and that everyone else in the room was destined for eternal torment. The arguments grew heated. Voices rose, accusations were hurled. More than once the emperor had to intervene, calling for silence with a sharp clap of his hands, reminding the assembled scholars that they were there to seek truth, not to defend their own egos. But despite the conflict, despite the anger and the frustration, something remarkable was happening in that small building in Futepa Sikri. For the first time in centuries, perhaps for the first time in the history of South Asia, representatives of different religious traditions were sitting together, listening to each other, engaging with each other's ideas, not as enemies to be defeated, but as fellow seekers after something larger than themselves. As the years passed and the debates continued, Akbar's own religious beliefs began to shift and evolve. He moved away from the orthodox Islam of his upbringing towards something more personal, more syncretic, more difficult to categorize. He stopped praying in the mosque. Not because he had lost faith in God, but because he had come to believe that God could be found everywhere, in the rising of the sun and the flowing of the river and the kindness of a stranger. Not only in the words of a particular scripture or the rituals of a particular tradition. He began to celebrate Hindu festivals alongside Muslim ones, lighting lamps at Diwali, throwing coloured powder at Holi, not as a political gesture, but because he genuinely enjoyed them, found in them a joy and a beauty that he had not found in the more austere practices of his ancestors. He became a vegetarian, influenced by the Jain monks, who argued that all life was sacred and that the killing of animals for food was a violence against the divine presence that resided in every living creature. He adopted the Zoroastrian practice of maintaining a sacred fire, tended by priests from Gujarat, who kept the flames burning day and night, believing that fire was a symbol of the divine light that shone in every human heart. He began to develop a new religious philosophy, one that he called the Din-e-Ilahi, the divine faith. Not a new religion in the conventional sense, but a set of ethical principles drawn from the various traditions he had studied. The importance of charity, the practice of non-violence, the cultivation of inner virtue. Above all, the recognition that there were many paths to God and that no single tradition had a monopoly on the truth. The Din-e-Ilahi was never intended to be a mass movement. It was never intended to replace Islam or Hinduism or any other established faith. It was a small thing, an intimate thing, a path for the emperor and his closest followers, a way of organizing their lives around principles that seemed to them to transcend the boundaries of sect and scripture. Only a few dozen people ever formally joined, and even they continued to practice their own religions alongside the new rituals that Akbar had devised. A daily meditation, a prayer of gratitude before meals, a commitment to performing at least one act of charity each day. To outsiders, the Din-e-Ilahi seemed strange, even heretical. A mishmash of borrowed ideas held together by the emperor's personal authority rather than by any coherent theology. But to those who participated, it was something precious, a space of spiritual freedom in a world where religious identity was usually determined by birth and enforced by law. It allowed a Muslim noble to respect Hindu scripture, allowed a Hindu courtier to attend Friday prayers at the mosque, allowed a Jain monk to acknowledge the wisdom of the Christian Gospels, all without abandoning the traditions that had shaped them. At the centre of it all sat Akbar, the illiterate emperor who had listened his way to wisdom. A man who had come to believe that God was too large, too mysterious, too infinitely various to be captured in any single set of words, any single ritual, any single path. But Akbar's religious openness was not only a matter of philosophy and personal practice. It was also, and perhaps more importantly, a matter of politics and governance. A way of holding together an empire that contained more different faiths than any ruler had ever attempted to govern. The most visible expression of this political approach was his relationship with the Rajput kingdoms of Rajasthan, the Hindu warrior clans who had resisted Muslim rule for centuries and who controlled the hill fortresses and desert trade routes of the western part of the subcontinent. Previous rulers had tried to conquer the Rajputs by force, sending armies into their territories, besieging their forts, slaughtering their populations when they refused to submit. The Rajputs had always fought back, fiercely and bravely, preferring death to dishonour, and the result had been centuries of bloodshed and stalemate. Akbar took a different approach. He married a Rajput princess, the daughter of Raja Barmal of Amber, and he did not ask her to convert to Islam or to abandon her own religious practices. He continued to worship the Hindu gods in her private chambers, celebrating the same festivals she had celebrated as a girl, eating the same foods, wearing the same clothes. Her brothers and cousins were welcomed into the Mughal court as nobles of the highest rank, given commands in the imperial army and appointments in the imperial administration. The message this sent to the other Rajput kingdoms was clear and unmistakable. You do not have to become Muslim to become Mughal. You do not have to abandon your gods or your traditions or your identity. You only have to accept the emperor's authority, and in return, he will protect you, honour you, and treat you as an equal. The marriage alliances that Akbar forged with the Rajput houses were not cynical political arrangements. Or not only cynical political arrangements. The emperor genuinely admired the Rajputs. He respected their courage and their loyalty and their fierce sense of honour. He spent time with his wife's family, learning their customs and their language, eating their food and listening to their stories. He came to love the festivals of the Hindu calendar, the lights of Diwali and the colours of Holi, and the autumn fast of Navratri, when the women of the court prayed to the goddess Durga for the protection of their families. The Rajputs, in turn, came to respect him. They saw him not as a foreign conqueror, but as a leader who valued them for who they were, not for who he wanted them to become. They fought for him on battlefields across the empire, their swords and their lances and their famous war cries striking fear into the hearts of his enemies. They governed provinces in his name, collected taxes, and maintained order and dispensed justice according to the principles he had taught them. When he died, decades later, they mourned him as one of their own, a kinsman who had honoured their traditions and protected their people, and made them proud to be both Rajput and Mughal, both Hindu and servants of a Muslim emperor. The administration of a multi-faith empire required more than good intentions and marriage alliances. It required laws and policies that treated all subjects equally, regardless of their religious background. Akbar abolished the jizya, the tax on non-Muslims that had been a feature of Islamic rule for centuries, because he believed that it created a division between himself and his Hindu subjects that made true loyalty impossible. He prohibited the forcible conversion of prisoners of war, a common practice among his predecessors, and he ordered his generals to treat captured soldiers and civilians with humanity, regardless of their faith. He built temples for his Hindu subjects, endowing them with land and revenue so that the priests could maintain the rituals that had been performed for generations. He protected the Jain monasteries of Gujarat from the attacks of Orthodox Muslims, who considered them idols to be destroyed. He welcomed the Sikh gurus to his court, listening to their hymns and their teachings with the same respectful attention he gave to the scholars of the Ibadat Khana. He appointed men of all faiths to the highest positions in his government, not as tokens or exceptions, but because they were the most qualified, the most capable, the most loyal servants of the empire he was building. His finance minister, Raja Tadar Mal, was a Hindu who reformed the tax system with such brilliance that his methods would be studied for centuries. His foreign minister, Raja Birbal, was a Hindu whose wit and wisdom became legendary throughout the empire. His closest friend and confidant, Abul Fazl, was a Muslim scholar who wrote the history of Akbar's reign in prose so beautiful that it is still read and admired today. None of these men were chosen because of their religion. They were chosen because of their character, their intelligence, their loyalty to the emperor, who who had given them the opportunity to serve. Not everyone approved of Akbar's religious policies. There were Orthodox Muslims who considered him a heretic, a betrayer of Islam, a man who had abandoned the faith of his fathers in favour of a vague and dangerous universalism. They whispered against him in the mosques, wrote letters to the ulama in Mecca and Baghdad, and plotted to replace him with a more pious ruler, someone who would restore the primacy of Islamic law and punish the infidels who had been given too much power. Some of these plots were serious, involving high-ranking nobles who had the resources to raise armies and the connections to seek foreign support. Akbar dealt with them firmly, but not cruelly, executing the leaders and pardoning the followers, sending a message that rebellion would not be tolerated, but that honest disagreement was not a crime. He did not persecute the Orthodox. He did not force them to abandon their beliefs or to pretend to accept his own. He simply asked that they obey the laws of the empire, respect the rights of their fellow subjects, and refrain from trying to impose their version of truth on those who saw the world differently. It was not a perfect solution, not a permanent peace. But it was enough, for a time, to hold the empire together, to allow Hindus and Muslims, Jains and Christians, Zoroastrians and Sikhs to live side by side in a degree of harmony that had not been seen in South Asia before and would not be seen again for centuries. The Ibadat Khana at Fatehpur Sikri still stands, though it has been centuries since anyone debated theology in its shaded arches. The building is simple, almost plain, its sandstone walls worn smooth by wind and rain and the passage of time. But if you stand inside it, in the quiet of the afternoon, when the tourists have gone and the birds have fallen silent, you can almost hear the echoes of those Thursday evening debates, the voices of the mullahs and the pandits, the monks and the priests, all of them arguing and listening and learning, all of them seeking something larger than themselves. At the centre of it all, there is the emperor. Not a young man anymore, but still calm, still patient, still curious, his dark eyes moving from speaker to speaker, his head tilted slightly to one side, listening, always listening, trying to find the truth that he believed was hidden somewhere beneath the words. He never found it, perhaps, or never found it completely. The truth about God is not the kind of thing that can be captured in a single Thursday evening or a single lifetime of listening. But he kept searching, kept asking, kept opening his mind to new ideas and new perspectives. That act of searching, that willingness to admit that he did not have all the answers, it may have been the most religious thing about him. The quality that set him apart from all the other kings and emperors who had ruled before him and would rule after. Fatehpur Sikri rose from the red earth of Rajasthan like a vision. A city built not for defence or for commerce, but for beauty, for the simple pleasure of creating something that would outlast the generations who built it. The emperor had chosen the site after a prediction from a holy man, a Sufi saint named Salim Chishti, who lived in a cave on the ridge and who had told Akbar that he would father 3 sons who would carry his legacy forward. When the prediction came true, the emperor decided to honour the saint by building a new capital at the place where they had met, a city of palaces and courts and gardens and mosques, all of it carved from the same soft red sandstone that glowed in the morning light and deepened to rose as the sun went down. The work took 15 years. Thousands of masons and carpenters and stone carvers labouring in the heat and the dust, their chisels ringing against the rock like the bells of 1,000 temples. When it was finished, Fatehpur Sikri was unlike any city that had been built before in India. Not a Hindu city, not a Muslim city, a Mughal city. A place where Persian arches and Indian carved screens and Central Asian domes came together in a new and beautiful synthesis. A style that belonged to the empire and to the emperor who had dreamed it into being. The city was built around courtyards, each one designed for a different purpose, each one opening onto the next in a sequence that led the visitor from the public world of the court to the private world of the emperor's family. The Diwan-i-Am, the hall of public audience, stood near the entrance. Its wide open space was designed to hold the crowds of petitioners and nobles who came each day to seek the emperor's favour. Behind it lay the Diwan-i-Khas, the hall of private audience, where the emperor met with his closest advisors in a circular room centred on a single pillar. A space that seemed to float above the ground, detached from the ordinary concerns of the world. Beyond that were the palaces of the empresses, the wives and mothers and daughters of the emperor, their courtyards filled with fountains and gardens, their walls covered with paintings of flowers and birds and scenes from the Persian love stories that the women read aloud to each other in the long afternoons. At the edge of the city, overlooking the artificial lake that the emperor had ordered his engineers to dig, stood the tomb of Salim Chishti, a small building of white marble that seemed to glow from within, its carved screens so delicate that light passed through them like water through a sieve. The saint was buried there, in a simple grave covered with a cloth that the emperor himself had embroidered. Pilgrims still come to seek his blessing, just as they came in Akbar's time. Some things do not change, even when empires fall and cities crumble into dust. The Ain-i-Akbari was a book like no other, a record of the empire so detailed, so comprehensive, so lovingly assembled that it seemed to contain the whole world between its leather covers. The emperor had commissioned it from his friend and historian Abul Fazl, a scholar whose mind was as vast and curious as Akbar's own, and together they had spent years gathering information about every aspect of the realm, its geography and its climate, its crops and its animals, its peoples and their customs, its laws and its revenues, its armies and its navies, its poets and its painters and its musicians. Nothing was too small to be recorded, too insignificant to be noticed. The Ain-i-Akbari described the different varieties of mangoes grown in the empire, the different ways of training elephants for battle, the different styles of turban worn by the nobles of different regions. It listed the prices of cloth and grain and spices in the markets of 100 cities, the salaries paid to soldiers and clerks and cooks, the distances between one staging post and the next along the Grand Trunk Road. It was a portrait of an empire in words, a snapshot of a moment in time when the Mughal realm was at its height. It remains today one of the most extraordinary documents ever created by any government anywhere in the world. Akbar could not read a word of it, of course, but he listened as Abul Fazl read aloud from its pages. He corrected and amended and added. The book was his vision as much as it was his historian's, and he wanted it to be true, not just accurate, but true, a faithful reflection of the world he had spent his life building. The painters of the Mughal atelier worked in a long room at the top of a palace, where the light fell evenly through windows placed high in the walls. The emperor would visit them in the afternoons, walking quietly among their easels, watching them work. They had come from all over the world, Persian miniaturists whose ancestors had illustrated the great books of Shiraz and Tabriz, Hindu painters from Gujarat and Rajasthan who had learned to capture the colours of the monsoon and the grace of a woman's hand, European artists who had brought with them the new techniques of perspective and shading that were transforming the art of the West. Under Akbar's patronage, these different traditions began to merge and blend, creating something new, something that had never existed before. The Persian love of pattern and detail met the Indian love of colour and movement, and from their union came a school of painting that would influence the art of South Asia for centuries. The painters illustrated manuscripts, creating images so vivid that the figures seemed to breathe on the page, their eyes following the reader, their clothes rustling with the suggestion of movement. They painted portraits of the emperor and his nobles, capturing not just their faces, but their characters. The way a man held his head, the way light fell across his hands. They painted the world around them. The animals of the imperial zoo, the flowers of the imperial gardens, the birds that nested in the eaves of the palace. All of it rendered with a loving attention to detail that made the ordinary seem extraordinary, the temporary seem eternal. Tansen came to Akbar as a young man, already famous throughout northern India for his ability to make the ragas come alive. He could summon the moods and emotions that the ancient texts said were hidden within the notes. He was a Hindu, trained in the classical traditions of the subcontinent, but he was also a student of Persian music, a master of the instruments and scales that had come from Central Asia and the Middle East. Under Akbar's patronage, he brought these traditions together, creating new ragas that combined the melodic structures of India with the rhythmic patterns of Persia. New songs that Hindus and Muslims could both love, because the beauty of the music transcended the boundaries of religion and language. The emperor would sit for hours in the hall of private audience, his eyes closed, his head tilted slightly to one side, listening as Tansen's voice rose and fell. The notes of the veena and the sarangi wove around each other like vines climbing a wall. Sometimes the music was so beautiful that the emperor wept, tears running down his cheeks without shame. He had learned that beauty was not something to be controlled or analysed, but something to be experienced, surrendered to, allowed to wash over him like the waters of the river flowing past the palace walls. The musicians played on, night after night, year after year. The emperor was generous with his patronage, and the music, like the empire, was something that needed to be created and recreated each day, each moment, each breath. The merging of Persian and Indian aesthetics was not limited to painting and music. It could be seen everywhere in the Mughal world, in the clothes that people wore, in the food that they ate, in the gardens that they planted, in the poetry that they recited. Persian was the language of the court, the language of administration and diplomacy and high culture. But Hindavi was the language of the people, the language of the marketplace and the home and the heart. Over time, these two languages began to blend, creating something new, something that was neither Persian nor Hindavi, but both at once. This new language would eventually be called Urdu, a word that means army or camp, because it was born in the interaction of soldiers and merchants and travellers from different backgrounds, all of them needing to communicate with each other, all of them borrowing words and phrases and grammatical structures until a new tongue emerged, rich and flexible and beautiful. The same blending could be seen in the clothes of the court, where the flowing robes of Central Asia were combined with the lighter cottons of India, creating garments that were practical in the heat, but elegant in their simplicity. It could be seen in the food, where Persian rice dishes were flavoured with Indian spices, creating the biryanis and pulaus that are still eaten today. It could be seen in the gardens, where the formal geometry of Persian paradise gardens was softened by the lush plantings of the Indian subcontinent, creating spaces of cool shade and flowing water. Spaces where the soul could rest and the mind could wander. Spaces that felt like a foretaste of heaven. The poets of the Mughal court wrote in Persian, the language of elegance and refinement, but their poems were filled with images drawn from the Indian landscape. The monsoon clouds, the lotus flowers, the mango blossoms, the peacocks dancing in the rain. They wrote of love and loss, of beauty and death, of the transience of worldly power and the permanence of the soul. All the old themes that poets had written about for centuries, but they wrote them in a new voice, a voice that belonged to this place and this time, a voice that could not have existed anywhere else. Akbar listened to their poems in the evenings, after the business of the day was finished. Sitting on his cushions, with his eyes half closed, letting the words wash over him like music. He could not read the poems on the page, but he could hear them in the voices of the poets. He understood that poetry was not about the meaning of the words, but about the sound of them, the rhythm and the rhyme, and the way that certain combinations of syllables could create feelings that prose could never capture. He loved the poets, loved their company and their conversation, loved the way they could take the raw material of daily life and transform it into something beautiful, something that would outlast them, something that would be read and recited and remembered long after the poets themselves had returned to the dust from which they came. The arts of the Mughal Empire were not a luxury. They were not an ornament added to the surface of power. They were central, essential. They gave meaning to the whole enterprise of building and ruling and conquering. Akbar understood that an empire of force alone would not last. An empire of laws alone would not inspire love. An empire of wealth alone would not touch the human heart. He needed something more, something that could speak to the deepest parts of the people he ruled, something that could make them feel that the empire was not just an abstract entity, but a living thing, a community of souls bound together by a shared appreciation for beauty. The painters and musicians and poets and architects he gathered around him were not servants of the state. They were partners in the great work of civilization, the slow, patient work of creating a world that was not only functional but beautiful, not only powerful but wise, not only rich but good. The things they created, the paintings, the buildings, the poems, the ragas, have survived the empire itself. They have survived the centuries of war and neglect and indifference. Beauty, unlike power, does not fade, does not decay, does not depend on the approval of the powerful or the whims of the crowd. Beauty simply is, and it waits, patient and still, for someone to notice it, to appreciate it, to let it do its quiet work on the human soul. The later years of Akbar's reign were quieter than the earlier ones. Slower, as if the emperor had decided that the time for building and conquering was over, and the time for simply being had finally arrived. He was older now, his hair touched with grey, his face lined with the weight of decades, his body no longer as strong as it had been when he rode at the head of his cavalry across the dusty plains of northern India. But his eyes were still clear, still watchful, still curious. His mind remained as sharp as it had ever been, the great engine of memory and understanding that had carried him from a boy on a battlefield to the most powerful man in the world. He spent more time in his gardens now, walking slowly along the paths that his gardeners had planted with jasmine and roses, stopping often to rest on the stone benches that overlooked the river. He listened to music in the evenings, Tansen's voice floating through the dark like a lamp carried by a distant traveller. He read poetry, or rather had poetry read to him, the old verses of Hafiz and Rumi that he had loved since he was a young man sitting at his father's knee in the dusty camps of the exile years. He had done what he had set out to do, built what he had set out to build. Now, in the long twilight of his life, he was content to watch the world move on without him, to let the river carry him gently toward whatever lay beyond. But the peace of his later years was broken, as the peace of all rulers is eventually broken, by the ambitions of those who would come after him. His son Salim, the heir to the throne, was a restless and impatient man. A man who had grown up in the shadow of a father, too great to be matched, too successful to be surpassed. Salim had been given every advantage. The best teachers, the finest horses, the most beautiful palaces. But he had not been given patience. He had not been given the quality that had made his father's reign so remarkable, so different from the ordinary run of human history. In the final years of Akbar's life, Salim rebelled. He gathered an army of disaffected nobles and marched on the capital, demanding that his father step aside and let a younger man take the throne. The news broke Akbar's heart, not because he feared for his empire or his power, but because he loved his son, had loved him from the moment he had first held him in his arms, a tiny, squalling infant with his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn chin. He had hoped that Selim would understand, would see that greatness was not about seizing power, but about serving the people who depended on you, about patience and wisdom and the slow accumulation of trust. But Selim understood none of these things. The old emperor, the man who had never lost a battle, who had never been defeated by any enemy, found himself defeated by his own blood, by the son who should have been his greatest pride and his deepest comfort. The rebellion did not last, did not succeed. The nobles and soldiers who had followed Selim could not bring themselves to fight against the old emperor, the man who had led them to so many victories, who had treated them with such fairness and such respect. They melted away, one by one, returning to their posts and their provinces, leaving Selim alone with his ambition and his shame. Akbar forgave him. He had learned that forgiveness was not a sign of weakness, but a form of strength, a way of breaking the cycle of violence and revenge that had destroyed so many dynasties before his. But the forgiveness did not heal the wound, did not restore the trust that had been broken, did not bring back the years of peace and happiness that might have been. The old emperor grew quieter after the rebellion, more withdrawn, spending more time alone in his gardens and his libraries, speaking less often to the friends and advisors who had surrounded him for decades. He was preparing himself, perhaps, for the end, for the moment when he would lay down the weight of the empire and let someone else carry it forward. The court, sensing the change, grew quieter too. The voices softer, the footsteps lighter, as if everyone were trying not to disturb the delicate silence that had settled over the palace like a fine layer of dust. The world that Akbar would leave behind was not the same world he had inherited. It was not the fractured, fragile collection of warring kingdoms that a 13-year-old boy had been asked to rule. It was an empire now, a real empire, stretching from the mountains of Afghanistan to the delta of the Ganges, from the deserts of Rajasthan to the forests of Bihar. It had a functioning administration, a rational tax system, a professional army, a network of roads and sarais that connected the farthest corners of the realm. It had a culture, a distinct and beautiful culture that blended the arts and traditions of Persia and India into something new, something that belonged to this place and this time. It had a memory, a story that would be told for generations, the story of a boy who could not read but who had listened his way to wisdom, who had built an empire not with force alone but with patience and curiosity and a deep, abiding respect for the dignity of every human being. That was the world Akbar would leave behind. Not perfect, not without its shadows and its cruelties, but better, perhaps, than it would have been without him. More just, more beautiful, more worthy of the people who lived in it. In the autumn of 1605, the old emperor fell ill, a sickness of the stomach that would not ease, would not heal, would not release him from its grip. He knew, as men of his age know, that this was the end, that the river was carrying him toward a sea from which no traveller returns. He called his son Selim to his bedside, and he forgave him again. Publicly, so that all the court could witness the reconciliation and know that there was no division in the royal family, no reason for civil war or factional strife. He distributed his wealth to the poor, to the holy men and the scholars and the musicians who had enriched his life. Keeping nothing for himself, he had never cared for wealth, had never understood why men killed and died for things that could not be carried beyond the grave. Then, on the night of October 27th, 1605, as the moon rose over the Yamuna and the lamps of Agra flickered to life in the windows of 1,000,000 homes, the emperor closed his eyes and let go. He did not fight, did not struggle, did not rage against the dying of the light. He simply released his hold on the world, the way a man releases a boat from the shore, watching it drift away into the current, knowing that it will go where the river takes it, and that the river, in its wisdom, will carry it to the right place. The empire did not fall when Akbar died. It did not crumble or collapse or dissolve into the chaos that had surrounded his accession so many years before. Selim took the throne, calling himself Jahangir, a word that means world Caesar, and he ruled for 22 years, building on the foundations his father had laid. The painters continued to paint. The poets continued to write. The musicians continued to play. The culture that Akbar had nurtured was stronger than any single man, stronger than any single reign. But something was lost when the old emperor passed. Something that could never be replaced, never be recovered. It was the quality of attention he had brought to everything he did. The way he looked at the world as if it were worth looking at. The way he listened to other people as if what they had to say might actually matter. That quality was his gift, his unique contribution to the long and complicated story of human civilization. When he died, it died with him. Such things cannot be passed down, cannot be inherited, cannot be taught. They can only be lived, moment by moment, breath by breath, and then surrendered back to the mystery from which they came. The tomb of Akbar still stands at Sikandra, just outside Agra, a great 5-tiered structure of red sandstone and white marble that rises from the flat plains like a mountain shaped by human hands. The deer still graze on the grounds around it, as they have grazed for centuries. The peacocks still spread their iridescent tails in the courtyards where the emperor's wives and daughters once walked in the cool of the evening. The tomb is not a grand monument, not a Taj Mahal or a pyramid. Something simpler, more peaceful, more in keeping with the man who lies within it. The grave itself is open to the sky. Akbar had requested that no roof be placed over his final resting place, that the stars and the moon and the sun should shine down on him forever, the way they had shone down on him during his long and patient life. When you stand there, looking up at the sky through the opening in the roof, you can feel something of what the emperor felt, that sense of being connected to something larger than yourself. Something that does not end when a single life ends. Something that continues, slowly, gently, carrying everything forward. As rivers do, as time does, as love does, if we let it. The river moves slowly now, in the deep hour when even the palace sleeps. The only light comes from the stars scattered across the sky like seeds thrown by a careless hand. The last lamps of Agra still burn in a few windows, small flames that tremble in the night breeze. Their reflections reach down into the dark water, where they seem to float just beneath the surface, like lanterns carried by travellers moving through a different world. The court is silent, finally silent. After the long day of voices and footsteps, and the constant rustle of paper and silk, and the low murmur of petitioners repeating their grievances to clerks who have heard it all before. The final prayer has been said. The last forehead pressed to the cool marble floor of the mosque. The last whisper of Allahu Akbar fading into the darkness like a bird disappearing over a distant horizon. The water makes a sound that is not quite a sound, a low continuous murmur that is felt as much as heard. A vibration that travels up through the stone of the riverbank and into the bones of anyone who sits there long enough to receive it. The frogs have stopped their calling, tired perhaps of singing to an audience of shadows. The night birds have settled into their nests in the branches of the banyan trees that lean out over the water. There is no wind now, not even the faintest breath. The surface of the river is so smooth that it might be a sheet of dark glass laid down by some giant hand to reflect the slow procession of the stars. The stars themselves seem to move, though of course they do not, cannot, They are fixed in their ancient patterns while the earth turns beneath them, carrying the river and the palace and the sleeping city through the darkness toward a dawn that is still many hours away. A dog barks somewhere in the distance. A single sharp sound that cuts through the silence and then fades, leaving no echo behind. The guards on the palace walls shift their weight from one foot to the other, their armor creaking softly in the stillness, their eyes scanning the darkness for threats that never come. The empire is at peace now, sleeping as peacefully as the emperor who built it. The bats that live in the eaves of the Diwan-e-Khas have emerged for their nightly flight. Their wings make no sound as they twist and turn through the air above the courtyard, hunting insects drawn to the last dying lamps. A fish jumps in the river, a silver flash that catches the starlight for a single moment before disappearing back into the dark water. A ripple spreads outward in ever-widening circles until it touches the opposite bank and is gone. The water is cold now, colder than it was at sunset. The sun has been gone for hours, and the heat of the day has risen up into the sky and been scattered among the stars. The clay of the riverbank smells different at night. Stronger somehow, more earthy, as if the darkness has released something that the sunlight kept hidden, some deep mineral scent that speaks of ancient floods and the bones of creatures that lived and died before any human walked beside this water. The sandalwood smoke that filled the courtyards during the day has dispersed, carried away by breezes that have long since moved on to other places. The air smells only of the river now, of water and clay and the faint sweet decay of lotus blossoms that opened at dawn and closed at dusk and will open again tomorrow, as if nothing had happened. The emperor's private garden is empty, the fountain stilled, the lamps extinguished. The cushions where he sat during the long afternoons now hold nothing but the shadows that gather in their folds, like memories waiting to be remembered. The great gate of the palace is closed and barred. The massive iron lock turned by hands that have performed the same motion every night for years, decades, a lifetime of evenings ending in the same way, with the same sounds and the same silence following. The merchants who set up their stalls outside the gate during the day have packed their goods and gone home, leaving behind only the stains of spilled oil and crushed spices on the stone. Traces that will be washed away by the morning sweepers before the sun grows hot. The camels that carried salt from the desert and silk from the coast are sleeping now, their long legs folded beneath them, their breaths slow and regular, their dreams perhaps filled with the same cool water that flows past the palace walls. Water they will drink tomorrow when the sun is high and the day is long and the road stretches out before them like a promise. The cooks who fed the thousands who passed through the palace each day have banked their fires, covered their pots, retired to their quarters where they lie awake for a while longer, planning the meals of tomorrow, deciding which spices to use and which dishes to prepare. The empire never stops eating, never stops needing, never stops demanding that someone care for its smallest needs. The women of the Zenana have taken down their hair, let it fall loose across their shoulders. They are brushing it slowly, methodically, counting the strokes as their mothers taught them and their mothers' mothers before that. The children are asleep, finally asleep. After hours of begging for one more story, one more cup of water, one more kiss before they close their eyes and let the darkness take them. The old men who sit by the river during the day, watching the boats and the birds and the slow passage of the water, have gone to their homes, have eaten their evening meals, have said their prayers. They are lying now on their cots in the courtyards of their houses, listening to the same river sounds that they have listened to every night of their long lives. Sounds that will continue after they are gone, after their children are gone, after the empire itself is gone and forgotten. The river does not know their names, does not care about their hopes or their fears or the small dramas of their days. But it carries them anyway, carries their reflections and their memories and the echoes of their voices, carrying everything forward, slowly, gently, as rivers do. The moon has set now, or perhaps it never rose, hidden behind clouds that have gathered in the west and are moving slowly toward the east, carrying rain that will fall on fields and forests and the rooftops of sleeping villages. The darkness is complete, the deepest darkness of the night, the hour when even the stars seem to dim, as if they too are tired of watching and have closed their eyes for a moment before resuming their eternal vigil. The guards on the palace walls have changed again, the new shift taking their positions with quiet words and gentle gestures, careful not to wake those who sleep below. The horses in the imperial stables stamp their feet and blow air through their nostrils, dreaming, perhaps, of the races they will run tomorrow, or of the cool grass of the meadows where they grazed as foals, or of nothing at all. Horses dream differently than humans, if they dream at all. The water flows past the ghat where the women come each morning to fill their copper pots, past the steps where the pilgrims bathe to cleanse themselves of sin, past the place where the emperor's boat is tied to a stone pillar, rocking gently against the current, waiting for a hand that will not touch its oars until the sun has returned and the day has begun again. The fish that sleep in the deep pools near the bottom of the river do not know that above them an empire rests, that armies and palaces and courts of law exist in a world they will never see, a world of air and light and the strange dry creatures who walk on two legs and speak in words that have no meaning beneath the surface of the water. The turtles that lie on the half-submerged logs at the river's edge have pulled their heads into their shells, withdrawing from the world until the warmth of the sun calls them out again. The night is cold, even in this land of heat and dust, and even turtles know that there are times when the best thing to do is to wait, to be still, to let the darkness pass without resistance. The heron that stands in the shallows, one leg tucked beneath its body, its long neck folded into the feathers of its chest, has not moved for hours. It has become almost a part of the landscape, a shape that the eye slides past without registering. The heron knows that patience is a form of hunting, that stillness is a kind of movement, that the fish will come eventually if you wait long enough. The silk cotton trees that line the riverbank have released their seeds, tiny parachutes of white fluff that drift through the darkness like snow falling upward, catching the starlight for a moment before settling on the surface of the water. They float for a while and then sink, joining the silt and the clay and the memory of everything that has ever been carried by this ancient, patient flow. The palace itself seems to breathe, its stone walls expanding and contracting with the changes in temperature, the slow release of the heat that the sun pressed into them during the long hours of daylight. The marble of the tomb where the emperor lies is cool to the touch, cooler than the air around it. The dew that will form on its surface before dawn is already beginning to gather, invisible yet, but present, waiting for the temperature to drop just a little more before it reveals itself as 1,000 tiny beads of light. The city beyond the palace is silent now, the streets empty, the market stalls bare, the only movement the slow drift of a stray dog or the flutter of a bat's wings against the sky. The night is long, and the years are patient. The river has seen it all before, has seen empires rise and fall, has seen kings and beggars, lovers and enemies, the great and the small and the forgotten, all of them coming to its banks sooner or later, all of them looking into its dark water and seeing something that they could not name, something that felt like truth or like home or like the memory of a dream that had been forgotten upon waking. The river does not judge what it carries, does not sort the precious from the worthless, the beautiful from the ugly, the important from the trivial. It carries everything, holds everything, accepts everything, then releases everything. That is what rivers do. What they have always done, what they will always do, as long as there is rain in the mountains and gravity to pull the water toward the sea. The lamps of Agra have all gone out now, the last flame extinguished by a hand that moved without thinking, that knew without being told that the night had deepened enough and that the light was no longer needed. The darkness will hold until the sun returns. The silence is complete, a living silence, a silence that breathes and waits and listens. A silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something else. Something that can only be felt when the world stops moving and the mind stops racing and the heart settles into the slow, steady rhythm of the river flowing past. The world that Akbar built did not vanish when he died. It did not crumble into dust or fade into the quiet oblivion that claims most human achievements. Some of it remains, even now, so many centuries later, visible to anyone who knows where to look and how to see. The red sandstone walls of Fatehpur Sikri still stand against the sky, their colours shifting from rose to crimson to deep purple as the sun moves through its daily arc, as it has moved for 400 years, as it will move for 400 more. The Great Gateway, the Buland Darwaza, still welcomes visitors who climb the steps to pass beneath its arch. Just as it welcomed travellers in Akbar's time, when the road from Agra was dusty and dangerous, and the promise of shelter within the city walls was a comfort to weary bones. The tomb of Salim Chishti still draws pilgrims, still receives their whispered prayers and their offerings of rose petals and silk cloth, still offers the same blessing that the saint offered to the young emperor who came seeking hope and left with a prophecy fulfilled. The river, always the river, still flows past the palace walls, still carries the reflections of the stars, still makes that low, patient sound that has lulled the people of this land to sleep for thousands of years. Long before Akbar was born, and long after his empire faded into memory. The language that grew in the bazaars of Akbar's empire, that blend of Persian elegance and Hindi earthiness that travellers carried with them from one city to another, did not die when the empire died. It grew instead, slowly, quietly, finding its way into the mouths of poets and musicians, of merchants and soldiers, of ordinary people who needed a way to speak to each other across the boundaries of region and religion. This language, which would come to be called Urdu, became the voice of a civilization. The medium through which some of the most beautiful poetry ever written was composed and recited and sung. The ghazals of Mirza Ghalib, written 2 centuries after Akbar's death, still move listeners to tears, still capture the ache of love and loss and longing with a precision that seems almost magical, almost impossible, as if the words themselves had been waiting for centuries for someone to arrange them in just that order. When you hear Urdu spoken in the markets of Delhi or the streets of Lucknow or the homes of Hyderabad, you can hear the echoes of Akbar's court in its rhythms, in its cadences, in the way it rises and falls like the voice of a storyteller who has been telling the same stories for 1,000 years and will tell them for 1,000 more. The tradition of miniature painting that Akbar nurtured in his atelier, bringing together artists from Persia and India and Europe, did not end when the artists died and their brushes crumbled to dust. It continued, passed down from father to son, from master to apprentice, through generations of painters who added their own visions to the great conversation that Akbar had begun. The Mughal school of painting flourished under his successors, producing works of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. Images that captured not only the faces of emperors and nobles, but the intimate moments of daily life, the quiet scenes that made the past feel present and the distant feel close. A mother braiding her daughter's hair, a musician tuning his instrument before a performance, a lover waiting in a garden for the one who had promised to come. These paintings survived the fall of the empire. survived the wars and the looters, and the indifference of those who did not understand what they were seeing. They are kept now in museums, in London and Paris and New York and Delhi, behind glass cases that protect them from the light and the dust and the hands that would otherwise reach out to touch them. When you stand before them, if you stand still enough and long enough, you can feel the presence of the artists who made them. Their breath still lingering on the surface of the page, their eyes still watching you from across the centuries. The words that travelled from the markets of Mughal India into the languages of the world are still spoken, still written, still used by people who have no idea where they came from or how old they are. Pyjama, that soft garment worn for sleeping or for lounging, came from the Persian word for leg garment. It was already old when Akbar's merchants carried it to the ports of the Arabian Sea, where European traders heard it and took it home and made it their own. Bungalow, that low, sprawling house with a wide veranda, came from the Bengali word for house in the Bengal style. It spread across the British Empire as colonial officials built summer homes in the hills and called them by the name they had learned from the people who had lived there for centuries. Shampoo, that everyday word for washing hair, came from the Hindi word meaning to press or to knead. It described the massaging motion that barbers used on the scalps of their customers, a practice that European travellers found so strange and so pleasant that they borrowed the word along with the technique. There are others. Dozens of others, words that live quietly in the corners of English and French and Portuguese, unnoticed and unremarked, carrying within them the echo of the bazaars where they were first spoken, the voices of merchants and customers and passers-by who had no idea that they were making history, that the words they used would outlast them, would travel further than they could imagine, would become part of the daily speech of people who would never know the world that gave them birth. The gardens that Akbar loved, those spaces of shade and water and quiet that he built throughout his empire as refuges from the heat and the noise and the endless demands of power, have survived in ways that he might have recognised, might have appreciated. The idea of a garden as a paradise on earth, a place where the four rivers of life flow through channels of stone and the flowers bloom in patterns that reflect the order of the universe, came from Persia and Central Asia. But it found a new home in India, where the heat and the dust made such spaces not luxuries, but necessities. The Mughal gardens that survive today, at Srinagar and Agra and Delhi and Lahore, still follow the same principles that Akbar's gardeners used 4 centuries ago. They are divided into 4 parts, representing the 4 corners of the world, with a central pool or pavilion where the 4 channels meet. The water flows downhill, because water always flows downhill. The fountains splash and sparkle in the sunlight. The cypress trees stand straight and dark against the sky. The flowers bloom in their appointed seasons. The whole effect is one of peace, of order, of the kind of beauty that does not shout but whispers, that does not demand attention but rewards it, that waits patiently for someone to sit down on a stone bench and simply be. The system of administration that Akbar created, with its ranks and its salaries and its careful accounting of revenues and expenses, did not survive in its original form. No system survives unchanged for long. But the principles that guided it, the idea that government should be rational and predictable, that officials should be chosen for their ability rather than their birth, that the state should protect the weak from the strong, these principles outlasted the empire that embodied them. They influenced the British administrators who came after the Mughals, who studied Akbar's methods and adapted them to their own purposes, who built their own system of governance on foundations that the illiterate emperor had laid. Through them, these principles spread to other parts of the world, to other empires and other nations, becoming part of the common heritage of human governance. The slow accumulation of wisdom about how people can live together in peace and prosperity under a common authority. It is not a straight line. Not a simple story of influence and inheritance. It is something more tangled, more complicated, more human. Ideas pass from one culture to another like seeds carried by the wind, landing where they land, taking root where they can, growing into shapes that their originators would not recognize and might not approve of. The spirit of religious openness that Akbar cultivated, his willingness to listen to different voices and to respect different paths to the divine, has proven more durable than the empire that nurtured it, more relevant to later ages than it was to his own. In a world that often seems divided by faith, by the conviction that one's own tradition holds the monopoly on truth, and that all others are not merely mistaken, but dangerous. The example of a Muslim emperor who celebrated Hindu festivals, who built temples for his subjects, who declared that no single religion could contain the whole of divine mystery. This example feels almost impossibly radical, almost impossibly hopeful. It suggests that there is another way, that it is possible to be deeply committed to one's own tradition without denying the validity of others, that the boundaries between faiths are not walls but doors, and that the doors can be opened from either side. The Ibadat Khana is gone now, its arches empty, its courtyard silent. But the idea that gave it birth, the idea that God is larger than any one scripture, any one ritual, any one path, that idea has not died. It lives in the hearts of those who refuse to hate in the name of the divine, who refuse to kill in the name of the merciful, who insist that the God who made the stars and the rivers and the human heart must be greater than our small attempts to define and confine the holy. The miniature paintings that Akbar commissioned, the portraits of his friends and his family and the poets and musicians who enriched his court, still exist, still speak to us across the centuries with a vividness that seems to defy the passage of time. The colours are still bright, the lines still sharp, the expressions still legible. The artists who made them used materials designed to last, mineral pigments ground by hand and mixed with binders that would not crack or fade, paper that was burnished and sized and prepared with the care that only great art deserves. When you look at a painting of Akbar from the height of his reign, you see not a symbol of power, but a person, a man with dark eyes and a calm expression, a man whose face has been studied and rendered by someone who knew him, who sat in his presence for hours, who watched the way the light fell across his features and the way his mouth moved when he was about to speak. That intimacy, that sense of direct contact with a living human being, is one of the gifts that the Mughal painters left to us. A gift that no history book can provide, no written description can replicate. It is the gift of presence, the gift of being able to look into the face of someone who lived 400 years ago and feel, for a moment, that the distance between then and now has collapsed. That you are standing in the same room, breathing the same air, sharing the same moment of silent recognition. The word shampoo is a small thing, a humble thing, not the kind of legacy that historians usually write about or that poets celebrate in verse, but perhaps it is the small things that matter most. The everyday words and objects and habits that travel from one culture to another without anyone noticing. That becomes so familiar that we forget they were ever foreign at all. When you wash your hair with shampoo, when you put on your pajamas, when you walk onto the veranda of a house that someone has called a bungalow. You are participating in a conversation that began centuries ago, in the markets and workshops of Mughal India, in the lives of ordinary people who had no idea that their words would travel so far or last so long. That is the nature of legacy, perhaps. It is not only the great monuments and the famous names, the paintings in museums and the poems in anthologies. It is also the small, unnoticed continuities, the threads that connect us to the past without our knowledge or consent, the habits and words and ways of being that we inherit from people whose names we will never know. The river flows on, as it has always flowed, through darkness and light, through winter cold and summer heat, through centuries of war and peace, and the slow, patient work of carving its way across the plain. The last light has faded from the sky now, the deep blue of evening giving way to the soft black of night. Somewhere in the distance, a single lamp still burns in a window overlooking the water, a small flame that seems to float between earth and sky, between the world that was and the world that is still becoming. The fire in the empty courtyard has burned low. The flames that once leaped and danced, now reduced to a bed of glowing embers, red and orange, and the deep, almost purple colour of heat that has no flame. The smoke rises in thin, almost invisible threads, carrying the scent of sandalwood and rosewater and something else, something older, something that might be the memory of all the fires that have burned in this courtyard over all the years. Each one adding its own small contribution to the air. Each one fading and dying and leaving behind only the faintest trace. The stone walls hold the warmth of the day still, releasing it slowly into the cool night air. The moonlight, what little there is, falls across the floor in patterns that shift and change as the clouds drift past the face of the moon. There is no one here now. No guards or servants, no petitioners or nobles, no emperor sitting on his cushions with his eyes half closed, listening to poetry or music or the sound of the river moving past the palace walls. There is only the silence and the fading warmth and the river, always the river, carrying everything forward, slowly, gently, toward a morning that will come when it is ready. Not a moment before and not a moment after. The night was long and the years were patient. The water flowed and the fire faded and the light lingered, soft and low and warm, like a breath held and then released, like a word spoken and then allowed to drift away into the stillness, like a river, always like a river.